investigating a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group, APT-41, also known as Double Dragoon and Wicked Panda. Let's get into how a data breach occurs when it's sponsored by an advanced persistent threat. Let's get into it. Okay, so I had promised that we would cover some real-world cases. I wanted to cover some cases before, but sometimes it's just not possible due to the sensitivity of an investigation. Anyways, in this particular case, I was retained by a corporation to assist them in a data breach investigation. The corporation's IT department had already performed their internal basic due diligence and believed that some type of SQL injection attack occurred, but they were not able to read any further into it. So that's when they hired my consulting firm to assist with the data breach investigation. And essentially, the corporation wanted to find out how the breach happened and if any data was exfiltrated, and if so, what type of data that the intruders were able to access and exfiltrate. Where to start with something like that? So typically, it's always best to start with the first source evidence or the first suspicious activity that was detected. In this particular case, the corporation's IT department noticed suspicious activity in their firewall logs that indicated it could potentially be a SQL injection attack. So knowing this, we decided to start our investigation with the IIS server, essentially the web server, and their Microsoft SQL server. And as soon as we started to examine the IIS logs, it became clear that a SQL injection attack did actually occur. So then the question became, well, was the attack successful or not? So the next step was to deep dive into the logs and determine if the attempted attack was successful. This is what the IIS log for this day looks like. And just have it opened with Notepad++. Typically, when we do any type of data breach or incident response investigations, we do use some specific tools, a lot of it built on ELK and some proprietary stuff that we use. Since I'm doing this demonstration here from home, I'm just going to use a very basic set of tools that anyone can use and follow. So yeah, have the IIS log for that particular day where the questionable activity happened, and so we can see here activity started at approximately 1:50 a.m. in the morning. And let's see. Okay, we can see here a lot of attempts to log in -process.asp. So it's an ASP page. We can see here we have a union statement. We can see here that looks like it is a script that it's trying to execute. And looking at the script, I can tell that that is an automated script, probably SQL Map or a similar tool. And the reason is, if you look at it, you see it's trying to call XP command shell, which obviously is native for Windows. But then within that same command, it's trying to do a cat on etc/password, passwd, which obviously is in Linux where passwords are stored, so the two are not compatible. So that's an error in a script, and from what I recall, that is a typical issue with SQL Map and is a common pattern. Oftentimes other tools will copy errors from one tool and one script to the next. So it could potentially be another script as well. But if it's not SQL map, it's going to be something very similar and something that probably borrowed some code from SQL map. Okay, so we're not going to use Notepad+++ to examine this, as the IIS log is a bit cumbersome to manually review. So instead, we're going to use some other tools, and I like starting with a high-level overview. So for this, we're going to take a look at the IIS log from a high level, and in this particular case, I'm using a tool called Deep Log Analyzer Pro. But you can grab any of a bunch of tools out there to do this. I want to take a look at what pages have been visited the most. And for this, I'm going to take a look at top pages by page view to get a better idea. And we can see here the login-process.asp is by far the page that has the most activity for the day. And then followed by a CAZ core error.asp that has the most amount of activity. And then there's significantly less activity for other pages. And more than likely, the majority of activity happened on the login-process page, and then any potential attempts to enumerate that failed were redirected to the error.asp page. That's the assumption here, and would probably make the most sense. So after having an idea of what we want to look at and which pages are going to be the most relevant ones, here it's going to be the login page. We want to take a look at the visitors or IP addresses that visited that particular web server that day. And by far what stands out is the 202.62 ... with a significant amount of activity, and then followed by a 5.10 ... The 202.62 ... is a IP address traces back to China, and the 5.10 ... is an IP address that traces back to the UK. Now, the activity for China is quite suspicious, as the client does not have any customers in China, so that's definitely something we're going to look at. They may have some clients in the UK, but we're going to take a look at that as well, because it looks like it may be suspicious. The other IP addresses that we see following are actually addresses that the client was using. So we're going to hone into those two IP addresses, and we're going to start with the 5.10 ... since it has significantly less activity. And for this, we're going to use a tool called Log Lizard, or Log Parser Lizard, which basically is a GUI for Windows log parser. Okay, so we're going to start here, run against the 5.10 ... and we're looking for date, time, CS method. We're looking for the actual query that was used, and of course the IP address. So we can see here activity started at approximately 1:50 a.m. And okay, we can see here enumeration really starts around 8:58 a.m. And as what you usually can expect, you're going to see a lot of inbound SQL injection attacks, as those are the most common. And here, we're seeing basically error-based SQL injection attempts for enumeration. See a lot of conversion failed as they're trying to enumerate the database. And the last activity here is at 9:45 a.m. Okay, so from this here, it does not appear that this particular attempt compromised the server. So let's take a look at the other IP address and see if we get more activity there. Essentially, based on what we see here, we know that a SQL injection attack already occurred, but at this point we're not sure yet if an attack was successful. So that's why we're looking at the 202.62 IP address to look at some more activity and find out what's going on. For one, we want to confirm more SQL injection attempts, and then we, more importantly, want to confirm if a SQL injection attack was actually successful. As web pages and companies are being targeted all the time for cyber attacks, that's in itself nothing new, and certainly not uncommon for corporations to have several attacks every day. So the important thing really is if any of the attacks are successful, right? And so that's what we want to see. Was the SQL injection attack actually successful? And we're running the query here right now. Looks like it's taken a few seconds, or a few long seconds. But yes, that's what we're going to be looking for. And then the next step really will be to see what actually happened if, presumably, they were able to successfully execute the SQL attack, right? So that's going to be the next step. All right, so here we can see this completed. And we can see here also at 1:50 a.m. is when this started on this IP address, so approximately around the same time. Given that both the IP addresses started at almost the same time, we can make a strong assumption that that was a joint attack and that both of the IP addresses were used. Okay, again here, select union statement with what looks like maybe this is cross-site script potentially. Let's see. Okay. All right, let's see what we have. Yeah, okay, more attempts. Here we're seeing now union-based SQL injection attempts. And syntax error, so we're having error-based and union-based. So basically both inbound types of attacks, which are pretty common. So let's scroll down a bit. Okay, we're seeing more of this. And we want to see if they were successful, right? And still attempting. Up, and yeah, all right. Looks like they were successful right around here, around 2:39, 2:40 a.m. And yep, they were able to enumerate a lot of information here from the server, such as command line activity, what you would probably get from an IP config, IP configuration, Ethernet adapter, DNS information, IP routes, MAC address, etc. Volume information for the C drive, dump of the local directory on the C drive for the various folders. We can see here program files, x86 and traditional. Data dump for a D drive as well for a directory listing. So yes, at this point, the SQL injection attack was successful, and there is a compromise. We can now see a mapping of the actual network, mapping out the several servers and or workstations that are in the environment. Okay. Okay, so we've confirmed that there's been a successful SQL injection attack. So now we want to make sure and find out what exactly did they do and what happened. Instead of continuing with this log parser, we're going to jump into a spreadsheet that I parsed what would be the most relevant information for this particular case. So we're going to jump into that and take a quick look. Okay, so this is what I've parsed here from, again, this is still from the IIS log of that day. And we can see right here that around 6:45 a.m., you can see that, they use the XP command shell, which is a stored procedure to be able to call the CMD command shell through SQL on the local server. And they created a file in the recycling bin called s.exe. And the reason they did that is to, obviously this is going to be a malicious file, right? So the reason they did that is to try to evade detection from antivirus or any other detection engine. Instead of writing it to the standard directory of the file system, they wrote it to the recycling bin to try to camouflage the file. Also interesting here is they took this file, this s.exe, and they broke down the file into a lot of small chunks and then sent that as a encoded stream and then reassembled that stream inside of the recycling bin. Okay, and in this particular case, this file is actually Cobalt Strike that they used, and you can see here the actual encoded chunks of the stream. And interestingly, I'm not sure why they had to do that, but apparently, or let me go back. XP command shell oftentimes is disabled because that's considered best practice, but a lot of people are not aware that you can easily enable that again by using the add extended proc, which stands for add extended process, XP command shell, comma, XP log 70.dll, which basically enables the XP command shell again. It looks like that in this case it was not persistent because after each execution of the data stream, they called the function again. And you can see this goes on here and goes on and goes on and on and on. And just to show you here, this is the actual stream, right? The actual binary code. And it goes on and goes on, and it basically gets all piped back into this s.exe file right here in the recycling bin at the end. And it goes on until literally the entire file is reassembled in the recycling bin. All right, about right here at about 6:47 is when the file was completed. And then they started another file, ss.log, and this time they wrote this to the Windows temp folder. And this actually was a legit file, but used for nefarious purposes. It's a file that's used to validate signatures of files. So that you can make files appear that they're native to Windows even though they're not. So that file would not have triggered any type of alerts with the AV system, and so that's the reason they wrote it directly to the Windows temp folder. But even after that, there's one more malicious file that they wrote, and that is s.exe text, and they wrote this again to the recycling bin, and in the same capacity. And this file actually is another malicious program called Sweet Potato. And Sweet Potato is a post-exploitation tool that's really designed for privilege escalation. So those are the two main tools that they used, is Cobalt Strike and then Sweet Potato. All right, so to show you, we took Sweet Potato and ran that actually through an online database, VirusTotal in this particular case. And this is what the results look like. So 35 of 70 engines detected this as Sweet Potato. With VirusTotal, you want to be careful. Sometimes you don't want to run files through VirusTotal in an active investigation, specifically if that is a malicious file or a piece of malware that may not exist out there yet in the wild. So you don't want to potentially alert intruders. A lot of people, like both cybersecurity experts as well as hackers and advanced persistent threat groups, are monitoring VirusTotal, and that's the reason. In this particular case, this was already out there, it was already known Sweet Potato, so there wasn't an issue in running that against the VirusTotal database. Okay. So yes, now we've confirmed that not only did they attempt a SQL injection attack, but they were successful with the SQL injection, and they were able to plant their tools onto the server in the recycling bin and execute them to gain full, not only local system privileges, but essentially map out the entire network. And ultimately, they use their tools for data exfiltration as well. So that's what an attack from an advanced persistent threat can look like. In this particular case, we believe that this could have been an advanced persistent threat from China based on the 202 IP address that traced back to China. But of course, that was not guaranteed. Someone could be using the proxy, or this could have been a spoofed address or something of that nature. So we needed to dig a little bit more into that. And one of the scripts, actually this is one of them in question, it's a VBA script. And when we look at the script itself, we can see here Xiaoshe, which is a Chinese name. So then that further raises the suspicions that this was a Chinese threat actor. And then in addition to that, we used one of the scripts that we started to further investigate. We found that on a Chinese hacker forum, this script was being discussed, and the author of the script was mentioned, and that was a Chinese individual. So again, everything pointed to China at this point. And now making the leap from a Chinese threat actor to actually an advanced persistent threat, how we determined that this was APT-41 was due to, for one, the sophistication of the SQL intrusion, the SQL injection attempt, and the breakdown of the tools into the chunks. And then we looked at the patterns and looked at what patterns does this activity match. And it actually did match the activity of APT-41. So to give you some more background on APT-41, this is a group that the FBI is still looking for. Here, this is the most wanted on the FBI's actual website. You can see here APT-41 group, wanted by the FBI. Here, these are some of the key players that they're aware of. Now, they have tried twice already to indict them, as to my knowledge. We can also take a look at and see what others are saying about APT-41. Okay, so here's some research on APT-41. And they speak of Log4j. That was not a flaw in this particular case. That was not the vulnerability that was used. But then here they also speak of after APT-41 exploited a SQL injection flaw to compromise a state government network. That seems to line up, as we have a SQL injection attack that happened. And if we look at more activity and research on this particular group, Group IB, which may have been the first to discover activity of APT-41, and don't quote me on that if I'm wrong, could stand corrected. Here they're saying that in reconnaissance tools, what they were using is Acunetics, Nmap, SQL map, one for all, subdomain 3, subdomains brute, and sublister 3. And SQL map, as we saw earlier, it indicates that this threat actor was using SQL map. And it appears that this threat actor was from China. So that all matches up. And, okay, they also experienced that APT-41 was using Cobalt Strike, which is also what we have in this particular case. Here they say a custom Cobalt Strike beacon was used in order to download malicious code to target devices and execute it. Once the payload was compiled, it was encoded in base 64 and then divided into chunks of 775 characters and added to a text file using a certain command. Well, that's exactly what we have here in our scenario, what our threat actor did. Now, it may not have been exactly 775 characters, the character count may have been different, but essentially we have Cobalt Strike that was encoded in base 64 to avoid detection, and then broken down into chunks, and then those chunks were sent in streams via SQL commands and were reassembled in the recycling bin as the file and then executed. So that pattern, again, matches up with what other cybersecurity groups and researchers have found of APT-41. This was an example of what an APT attack can look like. In our case, it was the Chinese threat actor group known as APT-41. They are currently still wanted by the FBI, and the FBI had previously released 2 indictments against them. Nevertheless, they are still active. If you encounter any data breaches that match any of their particular signatures, let us know, as we are currently still actively monitoring and following their activities. I hope this was informative, and as always, be secure and stay safe.